Princess Lyra of the Starborn Elves stood at the highest tower of her crystalline palace watching the twin moons rise over the capital city of Silvara, and the light reflected off thousands of glass spires creating rainbows that danced across the night sky. And she should have felt peace in this moment, but instead her heart was heavy with the weight of duty and responsibility that came with her royal blood. And beside her stood her two dragons, Ember and Frost, who sensed her troubled mood through the ancient bond they shared since the day they hatched in her presence 15 years ago. Ember was the larger of the two, with scales that shimmered like molten gold and flames that burned hot enough to melt starship armor, and his temperament matched his element with fierce loyalty and quick anger, while Frost was sleeker with scales of deep blue and silver that sparkled like ice crystals, and her breath could freeze metal until it shattered like glass. And she was calmer and more thoughtful than her brother, but no less deadly in battle. And together they were the most powerful bonded dragons in the entire elven fleet. The summons had come that morning from the High Council, and Lyra knew what they would demand before she even entered the chamber, and her mother, the Queen, had been preparing her for this moment since childhood, and the human colonies in the border systems had been expanding too close to elven territory, and the Council wanted war, and they wanted Lyra to lead it because she was their greatest military commander, despite being only 23 years old, which was barely an adult by elven standards who lived for centuries. Lyra had studied the humans extensively, and she knew they were a young species who had only discovered faster than light travel 200 years ago, and their technology was primitive compared to elven ships that used quantum drives and plasma weapons, and their lifespans were tragically short, with most humans dying before they reached 100 years. And the elves considered them impulsive and emotional and dangerous because of how quickly they bred and spread across the galaxy, and the Council feared that if they were not stopped now, they would eventually threaten elven dominance in this sector of space. But Lyra had read human literature and studied their history, and she found them fascinating in ways she could not fully explain, and they had survived and thrived despite having no magic and no natural advantages, and they created art and music and poetry that spoke of hope and love and sacrifice, and she wondered if perhaps the Council was wrong to dismiss them as mere primitives who needed to be contained or destroyed. The Council meeting had been exactly as she expected, and 12 elven lords and ladies sat in their high seats wearing robes of silver and gold and speaking in voices that echoed with centuries of authority, and they told her that the human colony on Kepler 7 had refused to evacuate despite multiple warnings, and the colony sat on a world that contained rare quantum crystals essential for powering elven ships, and the humans claimed they had legal rights to the planet because they had settled it first, and the Council dismissed these claims as irrelevant. Lord Commander Theron, who was her military advisor and had trained her since childhood, laid out the battle plan, and the elven fleet would jump into the system with overwhelming force and destroy the human defensive stations and then demand immediate evacuation. And if the humans refused, the fleet would glass the colony from orbit. And Lyra felt sick hearing this, but she kept her face neutral because showing emotion in front of the Council was considered weakness. The Queen spoke last and told Lyra that this was her duty and her destiny, and that she must put aside any sympathy for the humans, and remember that she was elven royalty sworn to protect their people and their way of life. And Lyra bowed and accepted the command because she had no choice, and refusing would mean disgrace and exile, and someone else would lead the attack anyway, and perhaps she could find a way to minimize the bloodshed. The fleet assembled over 3 days, and 50 warships gathered in formation above the homeworld, and each ship was a work of art, with flowing organic lines that looked more grown than built, and they were powered by quantum cores that drew energy from other dimensions, and their weapons could tear through lesser ships like paper. And Lyra stood on the command deck of her flagship, the Moonfire, and felt the power of the fleet at her fingertips, and Ember and Frost were secured in their combat harnesses ready to launch when the battle began. The jump to Kepler 7 took 6 hours, and the fleet emerged at the edge of the system in perfect formation, and immediately scans detected the human presence, and there were 3 orbital defense platforms and a small fleet of 20 ships, and Lyra knew the humans must have seen them coming, and decided to stand and fight rather than flee, and part of her admired their courage even as she prepared to destroy them. She opened a communication channel, and her image appeared on every human screen in the system, and she spoke clearly and calmly, telling them that they were trespassing on Elven territory and must evacuate within 6 hours or face destruction, and she tried to keep any hint of regret from her voice, and the response came 30 minutes later. And it was not from the colonial governor, but from the military commander of the defense fleet. The face that appeared on her screen belonged to a human woman who looked to be in her early 30s, with dark hair pulled back in a military bun and sharp green eyes that held no fear. And she wore the uniform of the United Earth Defense Force with the rank insignia of a squadron commander. And her name tag read Sullivan K. And she spoke with a voice that was clear and firm, telling Lyra that the colonists would not abandon their homes, and that the humans had as much right to this system as the elves. And if the elves wanted the planet, they would have to take it by force. Lyra felt something stir in her chest as she looked at this human commander who faced certain death with such calm defiance, and she recognized a kindred spirit, someone else who was bound by duty, but who questioned the orders they were given. And for a moment she wanted to reach across the void and tell this Commander Sullivan that she understood, and that she wished there was another way. But instead she simply nodded and terminated the connection, and gave the order to attack. The battle began with a coordinated strike on the defense platforms, and Elven plasma cannons lit up the darkness with streams of superheated energy, and the platforms returned fire with human railguns that launched metal slugs at a fraction of light speed. And the first platform exploded in a ball of fire and debris, and Lyra felt no satisfaction in the victory. The human fleet moved to intercept, and their ships were smaller and faster than the Elven vessels, and they used tactics that were unpredictable and chaotic. And one fighter broke through the defensive screen and launched missiles at the Moonfire, and the shields held. But Lyra was impressed by the audacity of the attack, and she ordered her tactical officer to identify the pilot, and the answer came back that it was Commander Sullivan herself, leading from the front like a warrior of old Lyra, made a decision that surprised even herself, and she ordered Ember and Frost to launch, and the two dragons burst from the flight bay with wings spread wide, and fire and ice trailing behind them, and in space their wings did not need air to fly, because the bond with Lyra gave them power that transcended physics, and they streaked toward the human fighters like avenging angels. Commander Sullivan saw them coming, and her fighter pulled into a sharp turn that would have killed most pilots from the G-forces, but she survived and launched countermeasures and chaff that scattered across space. And Ember breathed fire that turned the chaff into molten droplets, and Frost followed with a blast of cold that froze 3 human fighters until their systems failed, and they went spinning into the void. But Sullivan was skilled, and she dodged and weaved through the dragon fire with moves that seemed impossible, and she led Lyra on a chase through the debris field of the destroyed platform, and twice she almost got a missile lock on Ember, and Lyra felt a thrill of excitement that she had not experienced in years, and this human was magnificent. The battle lasted 4 hours, and in the end, the human fleet was broken, and 2 of the 3 platforms were destroyed, and the colony was defenseless. But Lyra had lost 6 ships and 43 crew members, and the humans had made them pay dearly for every meter of space, and as she prepared to give the order for orbital bombardment, she saw Sullivan fighter limping back toward the colony, trailing atmosphere, and 1 wing torn away. Something made Lyra hold the order, and instead she commanded her tactical officer to lock a tractor beam on Sullivan fighter and pull it into the Moonfire docking bay. And Lord Commander Theron questioned this decision, but Lyra told him that she wanted to interrogate the human commander personally and learn more about their tactics, and it was not entirely a lie, but it was not entirely the truth either. When Sullivan was brought to the brig, she was injured with burns on her arms and a cut above her eye, but she walked without assistance, and she looked at Lyra with those green eyes still showing no fear, and Lyra dismissed the guards and stood alone before her. Enemies separated only by a force field, and for a long moment neither spoke. Finally Lyra said that Sullivan had fought well and that her people should be proud, and Sullivan replied that pride would not save them from orbital bombardment, and asked if Lyra had come to gloat before murdering civilians, and the words stung because they held truth, and Lyra found H. The morning negotiations were tense and difficult, and the colonial governor was a gray-haired woman named Patricia Chen, who had led the settlement for 12 years, and she sat across the communication screen from Lyra, with suspicion and barely contained anger in her eyes, and Lyra could not blame her because the elven fleet still hung in orbit like a sword ready to fall, and the burned wreckage of human ships drifted in the darkness as a reminder of what had already been lost. Lyra laid out her proposal and explained that the elves needed access to the quantum crystals, but were willing to allow the colony to remain if the humans agreed to joint mining operations and attacks on extracted resources, and Governor Chen listened without interruption. And when Lyra finished, there was a long silence before the governor spoke and said that she would need to discuss this with the Colonial Council and would have an answer within 24 hours. Lord Commander Theron was furious when he learned of the proposal, and he confronted Lyra in her private quarters and demanded to know why she was negotiating with humans instead of following the council orders to evacuate the planet, and Lyra stood her ground and told him that the compromise would give the elves what they needed without the cost of continued warfare. And Theron said that the High Council would not approve, and that she was risking her position and her honor for a handful of primitive colonists. Lyra asked Theron if he had ever actually met a human, and the commander admitted he had not. And Lyra told him that perhaps that was the problem, and that the elves had spent so long looking down on other species that they had forgotten how to see them as people, and Theron said that sentiment was a luxury they could not afford, and that the galaxy was a dangerous place where only the strong survived. And Lyra replied that perhaps it was time the elves learned that strength came in many forms. After Theron left, Lyra went to the brig again and found that Frost had somehow convinced the guards to let her inside the cell, and the dragon was curled up next to Sullivan, who was gently stroking the scales along her neck, and both looked peaceful and content. And when Sullivan saw Lyra, she smiled and said that Frost reminded her of a cat she had owned as a child. And Lyra laughed and said that comparing a battle dragon to a house pet was probably insulting, but Frost did not seem to mind. Sullivan asked about the negotiations, and Lyra told her what had been proposed, and Sullivan nodded and said that Governor Chen was stubborn but fair and would probably accept if the terms were reasonable. And then Sullivan asked what would happen to her once the negotiations were complete, and Lyra realized she had not thought that far ahead, and said that Sullivan would be released, of course, and returned to the colony. But even as she said it, Lyra felt a strange reluctance, and she had grown used to these nightly conversations and the way Sullivan challenged her assumptions and made her think about things differently, and the idea of never seeing the human commander again left an emptiness in her chest that she did not want to examine too closely. Sullivan seemed to sense her mood and asked if Lyra was all right, and Lyra said she was fine and just tired from the stress of command. And Sullivan said that sometimes the hardest part of leadership was making decisions that everyone else thought were wrong even when you knew they were right. And Lyra looked at this human who understood her better after a few days than people who had known her for years, and felt something shift inside her. The Colonial Council accepted the proposal, and Governor Chen transmitted the formal agreement the next day, and Lyra felt relief wash over her, but also disappointment, because it meant Sullivan would be leaving, and she released the human commander that afternoon, and Sullivan stood on the flight deck waiting for the shuttle that would take her back to the surface, and Ember and Frost had come to say goodbye, and Sullivan hugged both dragons around their massive necks, and they rumbled with what sounded like sadness. Lyra wanted to say something meaningful but could not find the words, and so she simply held out her hand in the human gesture of farewell, and Sullivan took it, and their eyes met and held, and for a moment everything else faded away, and then Sullivan smiled and said, "Thank you for giving us a chance," and Lyra nodded and said that perhaps elves and humans were not so different after all. And Sullivan replied that she hoped they would have the chance to prove that. The shuttle departed, and Lyra watched it descend toward the planet and felt a strange sense of loss, and Lord Commander Theron appeared beside her and said that the fleet had received orders from the High Council to return to Silvara immediately, and that Lyra was to report in person. To explain her actions, and his tone suggested that the explanation would not be pleasant. The journey home took 6 days, and Lyra spent most of that time in her quarters trying to prepare her defense, and the High Council would see the compromise as weakness, and her mother, the Queen, would be disappointed, and there would be political consequences that could threaten her position as heir to the throne. And yet every time she questioned her decision, she remembered Sullivan's eyes and the family's on Kepler 7 and knew she had done the right thing. When the fleet emerged in orbit around Silvara, the capital was as beautiful as ever. But Lyra felt no joy at returning home, and she was summoned to the council chambers immediately. And as she walked through the crystal halls, she saw the way people looked at her with a mixture of pity and contempt, and whispers followed in her wake about the princess who had gone soft and betrayed her people for human sentiment. The council chamber was filled with every major noble house, and they sat in judgment like ancient kings, and the queen sat on the highest throne with a face carved from ice, and Lyra knelt before them as protocol demanded and waited for the accusations to begin, and they came fast and harsh, and lord after lady stood to condemn her actions and call for her removal from command. They said she had exceeded her authority and negotiated without permission and shown weakness to an enemy species and set a dangerous precedent that would encourage other species to challenge elven dominance. And some even suggested she had been compromised by the humans and could no longer be trusted. And Lyra listened to it all without defending herself, because she knew that anything she said would only make things worse. When the accusations finally ended, the queen spoke, and her voice was cold and formal, and she said that Lyra had brought shame to the royal house and violated the trust placed in her, and therefore she was stripped of her military rank and removed from the line of succession until she proved herself worthy again. And Lyra accepted the judgment with a bow and felt something break inside her chest. She was confined to the palace under guard and forbidden from leaving or communicating with anyone outside, and her quarters became a luxurious prison. And Ember and Frost were the only ones allowed to visit, and they sensed her pain and stayed close always. And she spent her days staring out the window at the city below and wondering what Sullivan was doing and whether the colony was thriving. 3 months passed in this way, and Lyra felt herself becoming hollow and empty. And then one night, alarms began blaring throughout the capital, and she rushed to her window and saw lights in the sky that were wrong, and ships were emerging from quantum jumps, but they were not elven ships, and their design was organic and twisted and wrong, and she knew with terrible certainty that something ancient and evil had found them. The scourge had been a legend and a warning told to children, and they were an ancient race that consumed entire civilizations and left nothing but dead worlds in their wake, and they had disappeared thousands of years ago, and most believed they were extinct or had moved to another galaxy. But the ships that now attacked Silvara were unmistakably scourge, with their black hulls that seemed to absorb light and weapons that tore through shields like they were not there. The palace shook as explosions rocked the city, and Lyra pounded on her door demanding to be released and let her fight. But the guards had orders and would not open it, and she felt helpless and furious as her people died, and she could do nothing. And then Ember and Frost did something unexpected, and they tore the door from its hinges with their claws and stood before her with determination in their eyes. Lyra did not hesitate, and she ran through the palace halls toward the command center and found chaos everywhere. And nobles and servants alike were fleeing in panic, and crystal walls were cracking from the bombardment. And she reached the command center and found Lord Commander Theron desperately trying to coordinate the defense. And the elven fleet was scattered and unprepared, and ships were falling from the sky like burning stars. Theron saw her, and for a moment looked like he would order her arrested. But then another explosion shook the building, and he seemed to make a decision and told her that they needed every commander they could get. And Lyra took her place at a tactical station and began issuing orders, and her mind fell into the familiar patterns of combat. And she felt alive again, for the first time in months, but the battle was going badly. And the scourge ships were too strong and too many, and the elven defenses were crumbling. And Lyra realized with growing horror that Silvara might actually fall. And then a new group of ships emerged from quantum space, and for a moment she thought it was more scourge. But the identification came through, and they were human vessels, and leading them was a ship she recognized. The alliance between elves and humans was formalized 3 weeks after the scourge attack, and representatives from both species gathered in the rebuilt council chamber and signed treaties that would bind their futures together. And Lyra stood beside Sullivan as the documents were sealed with both human ink and elven magic. And she felt the weight of history being made, and wondered what their ancestors would think of this moment. When ancient enemies became friends, Lyra's new role as ambassador required her to travel between Silvara and Earth frequently. And she brought Ember and Frost with her always, and the dragons became celebrities on Earth, where people had never seen such creatures, and children would gather whenever they landed to watch the magnificent beasts, and Sullivan would laugh at how gentle the dragons became around youngsters, and how Frost especially seemed to enjoy the attention. Earth itself fascinated Lyra in ways she had not expected, and the planet was so different from Silvara with its warm sun and blue oceans and green forests, and everywhere she went, there was diversity and chaos and life in abundance, and the humans had no magic, but they had created wonders through technology and determination, and she began to understand why they spread across the stars with such passion, because their homeworld had taught them to dream. Big Sullivan became her guide and constant companion, and she showed Lyra the mountains of Colorado and the beaches of Hawaii and the ancient cities of Europe and Asia, and they walked through streets crowded with humans of every color and culture, and Lyra realized that humanity's strength came from their differences, not despite them. And it was a lesson the elves had never learned because they valued uniformity and tradition above all else. But not everyone was happy about the alliance, and there were elves who saw it as a betrayal of their heritage, and humans who feared that the elves would use their superior technology to dominate Earth, and protests erupted on both worlds, and some turned violent, and Lyra received death threats from elven extremists who called her a race traitor, and Sullivan had to increase her security detail after someone attempted to bomb her apartment. The attacks brought them closer together, and Lyra found herself spending more time at Sullivan's apartment than at the embassy, and they would sit up late talking about everything and nothing, and Sullivan introduced her to human customs like coffee and pizza and old movies, and Lyra taught Sullivan the basics of elven meditation and showed her how to sense the magical currents that flowed through all living things. Frost bonded with Sullivan in a way that surprised everyone, because dragons typically only bonded with elves, and the connection was not as deep as what Lyra shared with her dragons, but it was real, and Sullivan could sense Frost emotions and sometimes see through her eyes, and Ember was more cautious, but even he grew to accept the human and would allow Sullivan to touch him, which was an honor rarely given. 6 months into her ambassadorship, Lyra was invited to address the United Earth Assembly, and she stood before representatives from every human nation and spoke about the importance of unity in the face of threats like the Scourge, and she talked about what she had learned from humanity and how the elves could benefit from human courage and adaptability, and the speech was broadcast across the galaxy and became a turning point in interspecies relations. After the speech, Sullivan took Lyra to a small restaurant in New York, and they sat at a corner table away from the crowds, and Sullivan ordered wine and raised her glass in a toast, and said she was proud of Lyra and everything she had accomplished, and Lyra felt warmth spread through her chest and realized, with sudden clarity, that what she felt for Sullivan was more than friendship or respect. The realization terrified her, because elven law forbade romantic relationships with other species, and the cultural taboo was even stronger than the legal prohibition, and elves who violated this rule were exiled from society and stripped of their magic, and she would lose everything, including Ember and Frost, who were bound to her through the royal bloodline. And yet, as she looked at Sullivan smiling at her across the table, she knew it was already too late. Sullivan seemed to sense the shift in Lyra's mood and asked if something was wrong. And Lyra wanted to tell the truth, but instead said she was tired, and Sullivan accepted this and suggested they go back to the apartment and rest. And as they walked through the city streets, Lyra stayed close, and their hands brushed, and she felt electricity in that simple touch. That night, Lyra could not sleep, and she stood on Sullivan's balcony looking at the city lights and thinking about impossible choices, and Sullivan came out and stood beside her and asked what was really bothering. Her and Lyra took a deep breath and decided that Sullivan deserved honesty. And she told her about the feelings she had been trying to ignore, and the laws that forbade them, and the consequences if anyone found out. Sullivan was quiet for a long time, and then she said that she had been feeling the same way and had tried to deny it because she knew it was complicated, but that she was tired of pretending, and life was too short, especially for humans, to waste on fear, and she took Lyra's hand and asked what Lyra wanted regardless of law or duty, and Lyra answered by kissing her. They kept their relationship secret and only met in private, away from cameras and official functions, and it was difficult and sometimes painful, but also wonderful. And Lyra had never felt so alive. And Sullivan taught her what it meant to live in the moment because humans did not have centuries to waste, and every day was precious, and Lyra began to understand why humans burned so bright. Because they knew their time was limited. But secrets have a way of coming out, and 4 months later someone captured a photograph of Lyra and Sullivan kissing in what they thought was a private garden, and the image was leaked to the media, and within hours it was everywhere, and the scandal exploded across both human and elven worlds, and Lyra knew that everything was about to change. The High Council summoned her immediately, and Lyra returned to Silvara expecting exile or worse, and Sullivan wanted to come with her. But Lyra said no because this was something she had to face alone, and she kissed Sullivan goodbye and promised that whatever happened, she would not regret their time together. And Sullivan cried and said she loved her, and Lyra said it back and meant it with everything she was. The council chamber was filled with angry nobles, and her mother, the queen, looked at her with disappointment and heartbreak. And Lord Commander Theron, who had become her ally after the Scourge attack now, looked at her with disgust, and the charges were read, and she was accused of violating sacred law and bringing shame to the royal house and consorting with a lesser species. Lyra did not defend herself or make excuses, and instead, she stood tall and said that she loved Kate Sullivan, and that love was not shameful regardless of species, and she said that the elven obsession with racial purity had made them weak and isolated, and that the alliance with humanity had proven that diversity was strength, not weakness, and her voice rang through the chamber with conviction. The nobles erupted in outrage and demanded immediate exile and stripping of her magic, and Ember and Frost, who had been waiting outside, broke into the chamber and stood beside Lyra, growling at anyone who came close, and the dragons, refusing to abandon their bonded, was unprecedented and created confusion because the magic should have forced them to reject her. The queen raised her hand for silence and spoke in a voice heavy with sorrow and said that the law was clear, and Lyra had violated it knowingly, and therefore she must be punished. And Lyra nodded in acceptance and prepared for the ritual that would strip away her magic and break her bond with the dragons, and she closed her eyes and thought of Sullivan's smile and decided it was worth it. But before the ritual could begin, alarms blared, and reports came flooding in of scourge ships attacking human colonies across the border systems, and the attacks were coordinated and devastating. And it was clear that the Scourge had been watching and waiting for the perfect moment to strike, and they had chosen now when the alliance was at its weakest, torn apart by internal conflict. The council dissolved into chaos, and everyone was shouting about what to do, and Lord Commander Theron said the elven fleet needed to be mobilized, but other nobles argued that they should leave the humans to their fate and focus on defending elven space, and Lyra felt rage burn through her because they were willing to let millions die over politics and pride. She stepped forward, and her voice cut through the noise like a blade, and she said that if the council abandoned humanity now, then the alliance was meaningless, and the Scourge would destroy the humans and then come for the elves, and they would face the enemy alone and weakened. And she said that she would take whatever ships would follow her and go to defend the human colonies with or without council approval. The queen looked at her daughter, and something shifted in her expression, and she said that perhaps Lyra was right, and that love could exist between species, then so could loyalty and honor. And she stood and declared that the full elven fleet would deploy to defend humanity, and any noble who refused would answer to her personally, and the room fell silent in shock. The months following the law change were both the best and worst of Lyra life, and she and Sullivan were free to be together openly. But that freedom came with a price. And everywhere they went, they faced whispers and stares, and sometimes open hostility, and there were restaurants that refused to serve them and hotels that turned them away, and hate mail arrived daily at both the embassy and Sullivan apartment. But there were also supporters, and people who believed that love should transcend species, boundaries, and human teenagers started a social movement called Love Without Borders, and they wore pins with intertwined human and elven symbols, and young elves began to question the old prejudices their parents had taught them, and slowly, painfully, society began to shift. Lyra threw herself into her work as ambassador, and she established cultural exchange programs and joint military training exercises and trade agreements that benefited both species, and Sullivan retired from active combat duty and became the human liaison to the elven military. and together they built bridges between worlds that had been enemies for so long. Ember and Frost became symbols of the alliance, and they participated in ceremonies and public events, and children of both species loved them, and the dragons seemed to understand their importance and were patient with the attention. Though Ember still grumbled about having his scales touched by sticky human fingers, and Frost would snort smoke at him and remind him that they were ambassadors too. A year after the law changed, Lyra proposed to Sullivan in the traditional human way with a ring and bent knee, and Sullivan laughed and cried and said yes, and they planned a wedding that would join human and elven customs, and it would be the first interspecies marriage in recorded history. And the media coverage was intense and overwhelming. The wedding planning was complicated because they had to balance two completely different cultural traditions, and human weddings were celebratory and joyful, while elven bonding ceremonies were solemn and magical, and they decided to incorporate elements from both, and the ceremony would take place half on Earth and half on Silvara, and guests from across the galaxy were invited. But not everyone was happy about the wedding, and extremist groups on both worlds threatened violence, and security had to be increased, and there were calls to cancel the event for safety reasons, and Lyra refused, because she said that fear could not be allowed to win, and Sullivan agreed and said that their love was worth fighting for, and they would not hide. 3 weeks before the wedding, a bomb exploded at the Earth venue during a preparation visit, and Sullivan was there inspecting the arrangements, and the explosion caught her in the blast, and she was rushed to the hospital with severe injuries. And Lyra was in a meeting on Silvara when she got the news, and she felt her world shatter. She took the fastest ship available and broke every speed record getting to Earth, and she ran through the hospital corridors with Ember and Frost flowing behind her in dragon form, and burst into Sullivan's room and found her wrapped in bandages with machines keeping her alive. And the doctor said the next 48 hours were critical, and Lyra refused to leave her side. She sat by the bed holding Sullivan's hand and talking to her even though Sullivan was unconscious, and she told her about all the plans they had made and the life they would build together, and she begged her to fight and to come back. And Ember curled up at the foot of the bed, and Frost laid her head on Sullivan's chest listening to the heartbeat. On the second night, when Sullivan's condition worsened, Lyra did something desperate and forbidden, and she reached deep into her magic and found the bond she shared with her dragons, and she extended that bond towards Sullivan, wrapping it around her fading life force and pouring her own strength into the human. And it was dangerous because bonding magic was not meant for humans, and it could kill them both. But Lyra did not care about the risk, and she felt Sullivan's life force flickering like a candle in the wind, and she fed it with her own energy. And the dragons joined her and added their power, and together they created a bond that should not exist, and pulled Sullivan back from the edge of death. And when Sullivan's eyes finally opened, Lyra collapsed from exhaustion. The doctors were amazed by Sullivan's recovery, and they had no explanation for how she had survived injuries that should have been fatal. And Sullivan could feel something different inside her, and she could sense Lyra emotions, and hear Ember thoughts, and feel Frost presence. And she realized what Lyra had done, and was both awed and terrified by the implications. Lyra recovered after 3 days of rest, and when she woke, Sullivan was sitting beside her bed, and the first thing Sullivan asked was whether Lyra understood what she had done. And Lyra said yes, and that she would do it again without hesitation, because a life without Sullivan was not worth living, and Sullivan kissed her, and said that she felt the same way. The bond between them was unprecedented, and scholars studied it with fascination and fear, and some said it proved that humans could evolve to accept magic, and others said it was a dangerous aberration that broke natural law, and Lyra did not care what they said because the bond had saved Sullivan's life and had connected them in ways deeper than any marriage ceremony could. The wedding was postponed, while Sullivan completed her recovery, and security was tripled, and the extremists who had planted the bomb were caught and prosecuted, and both governments declared that terrorism would not be tolerated, and the trial became a referendum on tolerance and fear, and in the end, the bombers were sentenced to life imprisonment. When Sullivan was finally strong enough, they rescheduled the wedding for 6 months later, and the preparations began again, but this time with even more security, and both human and elven military units were assigned to protect the venues. and Lyra made it clear that anyone who tried to disrupt the ceremony would face her dragons personally. The first part of the wedding took place on Earth in a beautiful garden in New Zealand, and Sullivan wore a traditional white dress, and Lyra wore elven ceremonial robes of silver and blue, and the ceremony was conducted by both a human minister and an elven priestess, and guests included diplomats and soldiers, and common citizens who had supported them from the beginning. Sullivan's sister was her maid of honor, and she cried through the entire ceremony, and Lyra best friend from childhood stood beside her and gave a speech about how Lyra had always been brave enough to challenge tradition and do what was right, and Ember and Frost were ring bearers, which was probably the first time in history that dragons had participated in a human wedding. The second part of the ceremony took place on Silvara 3 days later, and this was the traditional elven bonding ritual, and it involved ancient magic and vows spoken in the old language, and the exchange of crystal talismans that would link their souls, and the ceremony was held in the sacred grove, where the first elves had bonded with dragons thousands of years ago. The queen herself presided over the ceremony, and she spoke the words that would bind Lyra and Sullivan together in elven law, and when the magic flowed around them, forming visible bonds of light, Sullivan did not burn or break as many had feared, and instead she glowed with the same light, and the magic accepted her as if she had always belonged, and there were gasps of wonder from the assembled crowd. After the ceremony there was a feast that lasted 3 days, and nobles and commoners alike celebrated, and it was the first time in centuries that the palace had been opened to common people. And Lyra wanted everyone to be part of this moment, and Sullivan danced with elven lords, and Lyra danced with human soldiers, and the barriers between species seemed to dissolve in the joy of the celebration on their wedding night. Lyra and Sullivan stood on the balcony of their chambers looking at the stars, and Sullivan said that she never imagined her life would turn out this way, and that she had expected to die a soldier in some forgotten battle, and instead she had found love and purpose and a family that included dragons. And Lyra said that Sullivan had given her something she never knew she needed, and that was the courage to be herself instead of what others expected. They honeymooned on a neutral world that was claimed by neither humans nor elves, and they spent 2 weeks exploring ancient ruins and swimming in crystal-clear lakes and simply being together without the weight of duty and expectation, and Ember and Frost roamed free and seemed as happy as their bonded pair. But eventually they had to return to reality, and there was still work to be done, and the alliance was strong but fragile, and there were always those who sought to undermine it, and Lyra and Sullivan knew that their relationship would always be political as well as personal, and that they would be symbols whether they wanted to be or not. A new threat emerged 6 months after their wedding, and long-range sensors detected a massive scourge fleet gathering at the edge of known space, and it was larger than any force they had encountered before. And intelligence suggested the scourge were planning a coordinated assault on both human and elven homeworlds, and the Alliance would face its greatest test. Emergency sessions were called on both worlds, and military leaders argued about strategy, and some wanted to take the fight to the scourge, while others advocated for defensive positions, and Lyra proposed a third option, and she suggested a joint strike force that would use new tactics developed specifically to counter scourge technology, and Sullivan supported the plan, and together they convinced the leadership to approve it. 5 years passed after the final battle with the Scourge, and the galaxy had changed in ways no one could have predicted, and the alliance between humans and elves had grown into something more than a military partnership, and it had become a true union of cultures and ideas, and the borders between their territories had dissolved, and mixed colonies were established where both species lived and worked together. In peace, Lyra had stepped down from her military command and focused entirely on her ambassadorial duties, and she traveled constantly between worlds, helping to resolve disputes and negotiate new agreements and establish programs that would ensure the alliance survived for generations. And Sullivan had become the director of Joint Defense Operations, and she oversaw the training of mixed-species military units that combined the best of both traditions. They had built a home together on a world called Haven that sat halfway between Earth and Silvara, and the house was designed to accommodate both their needs with elven aesthetics and human comforts, and there was a massive cave system nearby where Ember and Frost could roost and hunt, and the dragons had grown even larger and more magnificent over the years. The bond between Lyra and Sullivan had deepened and evolved in unexpected ways, and Sullivan had developed minor magical abilities that no human had ever possessed before, and she could sense emotional currents and sometimes see glimpses of possible futures, and scholars studied her constantly trying to understand how a human could channel elven magic, and some theorized that the bond with Lyra and the dragons had fundamentally altered her biology. But with these changes came complications, and Sullivan aging had slowed significantly, and while most humans showed signs of age by 40, Sullivan looked barely older than the day they met, and doctors estimated she might live for several centuries now, instead of the normal human lifespan, and this was both a blessing and a curse because it meant they would have more time together. But it also meant Sullivan would outlive everyone she had known before meeting. Lyra Sullivan's sister had aged normally and now had grandchildren, and sometimes Sullivan would visit and feel the weight of time passing differently for her than for the rest of humanity. And her nephews and nieces treated her like a strange aunt who never got older and told stories of wars and dragons and magic, and it hurt to see her family grow old while she remained frozen. Lyra understood this pain better than anyone, because she had watched generations of shorter-lived species pass away, and she held Sullivan on the nights when the grief became too much and reminded her that they had been given a gift that most people could only dream of, and that loving someone for centuries was better than never loving at all. And Sullivan would nod and agree. But the sadness lingered. Their relationship had become a model for other interspecies couples, and there were now hundreds of human-elven partnerships, and some had even produced children, which was thought to be impossible. And the children were unique with traits from both species, and some had magic, while others had enhanced physical abilities, and they represented a new generation that belonged to neither species, but to both. The High Council had changed dramatically over the years, and several of the old conservative nobles had stepped down or been voted out and replaced with younger elves who had grown up seeing humans as equals and allies, and the Queen had even appointed 2 human advisors to the council, which would have been unthinkable a decade ago, and slowly the institutions were adapting to the new reality. But there were still challenges, and some elven colonies resisted integration and held onto the old ways. And there were human worlds that viewed the elves with suspicion and fear and worried about being dominated by their longer-lived and more technologically advanced partners, and Lyra and Sullivan spent much of their time addressing these concerns and showing through their example that partnership meant equality, not conquest. A crisis emerged when a group of separatist elves attempted to establish an independent colony far from human space, and they claimed that the alliance had corrupted elven culture and diluted their magical heritage, and they refused to recognize the authority of the High Council and began raiding ships that carried human passengers, and the situation threatened to explode into civil war. Lyra was asked to negotiate with the separatists, and she traveled to their colony with Sullivan and a small security detail. And the separatist leader was an ancient elf named Meridian, who had been one of Lyra's childhood teachers, and he greeted them coldly and said that Lyra had betrayed everything he had taught her about elven superiority and purity. The negotiations were tense and difficult, and Meridian argued that the elves were losing their identity by mixing with humans, and that their magic was being weakened by exposure to those who did not understand its sacred nature, and he pointed to Lyra's bond with Sullivan as proof that she had been corrupted and claimed that she was no longer truly elven. Lyra listened patiently, and then responded by showing Meridian what she and Sullivan had accomplished together, and she demonstrated how the bond had not weakened her magic, but strengthened it, and she explained that isolation and stagnation were the real threats to elven culture, not change and growth, and she challenged Meridian to look at the young elves in his colony and see the hope in their eyes, and ask himself if he was giving them a future or trapping them in the past. Sullivan spoke next, and she talked about her own journey from soldier to diplomat and from enemy to partner, and she admitted that the transition had been hard and that she still struggled with being different from other humans, and she said that fear of change was natural, but that fear could not be allowed to prevent progress, and that both species had benefited from the alliance in ways that went beyond military security. The debate continued for 3 days, and slowly some of the younger separatists began to question their leaders, and they saw in Lyra and Sullivan a vision of what their lives could be if they rejoined the alliance, and they talked among themselves, And finally, a delegation approached Lyra and asked what guarantees they would have that their culture and traditions would be protected. Lyra worked with them to draft an agreement that would give colonies more autonomy while still maintaining allegiance to the overall alliance, and she promised that no one would be forced to adopt customs they disagreed with, but that all must respect the rights of others to choose their own path. And most of the separatists accepted this compromise, though Meridian refused and left to establish an even more remote settlement. The resolution of the separatist crisis strengthened Lyra's reputation as a peacemaker, and she was approached by other species who wanted to join the alliance, and within 2 years, the Union had expanded to include 5 different civilizations, and Lyra became the chief ambassador to what was now called the Galactic Union, and Sullivan was appointed as the supreme commander of Union defense forces. Their responsibilities grew, but they made sure to protect their private time, and they would retreat to Haven whenever possible, and spend weeks just being a couple without the weight of the galaxy on their shoulders, and they would fly with Ember and Frost through the mountains, and swim in the crystal lakes and make love under the stars and remember why they had fought so hard for this life. On their 10th anniversary, Lyra surprised Sullivan with a gift that she had been working on for years, and it was a ship designed specifically for the two of them, with living quarters that felt like home, and a dragon bay for Ember and Frost, and the most advanced navigation and defense systems available, and she said that she wanted them to explore the galaxy together, and discover new worlds and have adventures like they had dreamed about. Sullivan was overwhelmed and said it was perfect, and they christened the ship the Unity, and began planning their first expedition, and they would travel to the unmapped regions, beyond known space, and search for other civilizations that might want to join the Union, and document new worlds that could be settled, and simply see what was out there, waiting to be discovered. But before they could depart, Lyra received a message from the Queen, requesting her immediate return to Silvara, and when they arrived they found the palace in mourning, and the Queen was dying, and she had lived for over 2,000 years. But even elven lives eventually ended, and she wanted to see her daughter one final time. Lyra sat beside her mother bed and held her hand, and the Queen spoke softly about her regrets and her pride, and she said that she had been wrong about so many things, but that watching Lyra follow her heart had taught her that courage came in many forms, and she was grateful that her daughter had been braver than she had been, and she said that Lyra would make a good queen when the time came. Lyra said she did not want the throne because it would tie her to Silvara and prevent her from continuing her work across the galaxy. And the Queen smiled and said that the rules could be changed, and that perhaps it was time for the monarchy to evolve, just as everything else had. And she made Lyra promise to consider it, and Lyra agreed, though she had no intention of accepting.